All right, give me a second. Okay. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through Louis Sullivan's Kindergarten Chats. And I think this is part 6 or part 7, I've lost track. But we're going to start with Man's Powers. It's one of my favorite chapters, part 7. Wonderful. So we're going to start with Sherri, and then it's going to be Maritza, Rob, Joia, and Rupali, and after which we'll do Q&A or breakout rooms depending on how much time we have. All right, so let's get started. Sherri, floor is yours.
Okay, we're actually going to be covering all the way back to education this week and all the way up to autumn glory. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, and I'm going to leave Man's Powers to Rob. And I know that Rupali is going to be covering education. So I'm actually going to sort of start here in the chapter on eminence. And what I wanted to talk about here is I'm going to leave democracy discussion mostly to Rob, and Shrikant, you've been doing a great job of explaining Sullivan's idea of democracy too, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit here, and mention that for Sullivan, remember, he talks about democracy as opposed to feudalism. And part of what he means when he says that, when he talks about this, is he's referring to democracy in the positive sense that humans should be thinking for themselves and they shouldn't be told what to think. They shouldn't be just following historical approach just because that's the way it was done. That's the sort of feudal approach he sees. And he talks a lot about self-governance, that we must be self-aware and able to think individually, and that democracy, that type of self-governance comes with a responsibility. And he's especially thinking that responsibility is that it's everybody's responsibility to individually think through ideas themselves and to not just take things that are spoon-fed. That's why this dovetails so beautifully with Montessori education. That's why a lot of what we've been talking about through all of this has been touching on Montessori. They come from the same root. We're going to use as many nature analogies as I can, right? So it comes from the same root, comes from the same enriched soil, both of these. But when Sullivan's talking about democracy, and for a lot of people, they may be thinking, okay, well, what does that have to do with architecture? And it gets back to that idea of individual thought, and not following a preconceived approach just because it was done in the past. So he explains this a little bit further in this chapter on eminence. When he talks here about buildings, the buildings are here, and they are the court of first inquiry. It is to them we go. It is not to the architect. For the building records with naked candor what the architect has done to it. It does not equivocate, apologize, explain, circumlocute, hedge, dicker, divert, or conceal. It simply tells, and it tells with awful honesty. We quiver with amazement and are at once aghast at the folly. The man may be the liar, but the building is not. It tells the truth about the liar. For buildings are our familiars. They are indeed loquacious, perhaps too talkative. And the testimony of the buildings are eminent. Let me start that again. By the testimony of buildings, our eminence are lightweight. By our measure of height, they are Lilliputian in nature. In stature. I have a corrector over here. So he's talking about this time in history when there's a cultural change happening. There's a ripeness for the culture to turn one way or another. And honestly, that always exists. If you look through history, it's really always there, but he has seen it really, really fresh. He has seen it because he himself is experiencing it in his own architecture. And I've talked about this before. We had the issue with the Chicago World's Fair, where the very much a feudal approach came lumping into Chicago, when Chicago really was this fresh new thought process happening. So he's seeing this as a very much, the buildings are a cultural barometer. And he's seeing this as a major, major turning point. And he's quite desperate to make sure his ideas get across. So as he's talking about these buildings and how they convey information to the rest of us, he says, we know this because the buildings tell us so. We have the inconvenient habit of listening to what a building says, of scanning the screen of its features, of looking into its soul. When I read that earlier this week, I had said to Rob, I think what I need to talk about is the fact that today we have sort of lost that ability to read. It's a language that we've lost, and it's a language we've lost in music. It's a language we've lost in art, and a language we've lost in building. But the more I read, and the more I refreshed my memory on these chapters, I realized, no, he's actually saying the exact same thing then as now. It's not that we've lost it. It's just that not that many people ever bother to learn the language, because in order to learn the language, you have to do it firsthand. It has to be observed individually. And he gets into that as we go on. He talks here about the output of our mental power. He exercises, constitutes in each of us. Okay, let me start that over here. To our eyes, the eminent one is unproductive in the democratic sense. More than that, because of our hybridity in the democratic sense and the productivity in the feudal sense, he's reactionary. Each instance, he's talking about the architect who is in the feudal sense, thinking in the feudal sense, that the output of mental power that he exercises constitutes a barricade, a deterrent to free-flowing thought, a menace to advance, a drag upon the evolution of free men. So he is seeing this approach. He's seen the deep understanding of what this firsthand and secondhand thinking causes. And he sees it in the architecture. When he's talking about the eminent men, he's talking about the book-learned architects. He says here, they have allowed their liberal and technical education to petrify them with culture instead of stimulating them through strengthened powers to sane and wholesome, far-seeing democratic activity with genuine utterance. So it's very much an approach, one or the other. And at one point here, I'm going to throw this one in because it's one of my favorite lines here. He says, I have no use for idols with clay feet. So he says, for we must see, hear, and interpret things and thoughts as they are. And that's where he's really getting to the crux of his approach. You need to, in order to understand the language and what the buildings are saying to us, you must observe it yourself. And that's why we keep getting this process where the student, Sullivan as the teacher will will kind of go over and over and say things a bunch of different ways. And then the student will have a breakthrough, an awakening. In this section of chapters, we get Autumn Glory, where it's a pretty serious awakening. The student themselves is now putting these thoughts, and I'll get to some of that in just a second. Then he goes on to compare two cities. He starts with our city, and he's referring here to New York. And he talks about the more it changes, the more it remains the same. The barbaric variety, the unrest, the ignorance, the vulgarity, the scholarship, the culture, the yardstick architecture, the blind man's architecture, the deaf man's architecture, the lame man's architecture, each gives out its raucous individual note. Doesn't that perfectly describe New York? And all together they swell and sway and swirl into a huge monotone of desolation and heartlessness, and of an incredible arid banality that roars above the muffled murmur of incompetence and strangulation. For here art is tortured, twisted, choked, and mangled, beaten, bruised, and torn. Poor art. For art here is swiftly starved and is dying of thirst. For art is not in the hearts of men here. So remember, he keeps talking about, he uses the word objectivity and subjectivity, and a lot of us are thinking he means different things. He really is meaning here, objectivity is material, subjectivity is spiritual. And one of the things that he is going to be talking about in these chapters on our city and another city, and he gets into it a little bit in this group of chapters, and he'll get into it more as we go on, that architecture must have that rational part, but it also must have that spirituality. And so what he's seeing in New York is a lot of chaos, which I don't think he would have a problem with if it also had that individual sense of spirit. And he writes here, they will find no rational pretext to discriminate between their works. And then as he's talking here about New York, he brings up this example of the Chateau, which, you know, this is another example of a historical approach. This is, I think it's one of the houses that he sees on the streets. Remember, this is New York from the late 1800s, not today. So it's a different New York. I was going to dig up pictures, but you needed too many pictures to really get that in there. So in the book, they show a picture of a chateau in the middle of the city, which that alone is slightly strange. But then he has this extremely beautiful, clarifying thought. While the man may live in the house physically, he's talking about the modern man, modern at that time, New York man living in a chateau in the middle of New York. While the man may live in the house physically, he cannot live in it morally, mentally, or spiritually. That he and his house are a paradox. So this is getting at an important detail for Sullivan, that it has to be individual. It has to be reflective of its purpose. Of course, that's the form follows function, but it also has to always have that spark of spirituality. And in his case, that doesn't mean Christianity or anything like that. It just means that spiritual sense of wonder, and in his case, it's wonder and joy at the world. Then he goes on to another city, and he's talking about Chicago. And, you know, it's not that much more of a pretty picture, because it's also pretty chaotic. Cities are by nature that way. And he talks about Chicago as a city is, but he talks about cities in general. that a city is but the material reflection and character of its inhabitants. That is, a city in turn is but a screen. And behind the screen are the men, women, and children who will it, who suffer it to be, whose thought it is. It's as if you wandered dejected, but inquiring over this immense pollution, you find civic cleanliness, pride and self-respect, and capacity for creative self-government woefully absent. You will find it is specifically because cleanliness, self-respect, and pride and desire for creative self-government are thus absent in the mind of the individual, the so-called man on the street. So he is saying here a physical display of apathy in the built environment indicates a common spiritual apathy in its population. And then he goes on to say, for Chicago at least has youth, and where there is youth, there is always hope. And where there is hope, let us cling to it. There are few sparks remaining in the ashes of its short life. Fate may perchance fan them once more into the flame of democratic fire. It is a chance only, but youth is here. A critical turn is at hand. We shall see what we shall see, and we shall see it soon. So he's, again, we've talked about this before. He is sensing a very critical nature of happening at this point in time in architecture, where the cities have essentially a choice. They're seeing two polar opposites, one way to go or the other. He sees Chicago not as an epitome of what's going right, but having not yet gone wrong, I think is perhaps the best way to put it. And then there's another line here that I just have to put in because it gets at that sense of what he means by it needing to have spirituality. And he talks about how serene in power is the soul at peace. Then we get to this point. He's talking about the out of doors of the spirit. And I think that Rob's going to be talking about that too. But so I'm going to leave that for him. But that's just another one of those really lovely lines, you know, about like the canned soup earlier on, or we just soup cans. This is, do we have the out of doors of the spirit? But then we get to the Autumn Glory chapter. Oh, yay, the Autumn Glory chapter. And I wore my ginkgo leaves just for the day. Because remember, Autumn Glory is the student talking. And so the student has been listening and learning and observing independently, mind you, occasionally getting corrected here and there, occasionally other things getting pointed out. And then the student is coming up with this. What I knew at the end of my 4 years, meaning his 4 years of education, you saw only too well, nothing but presumptuous dudishness and a veneer of artificiality which concealed a little of the weak ignorance underlying it all. Well, it's no use crying over spilt milk. The mischief is done. We must rectify it if it's not too late. They made me weary enough at the time, their finical, farcical notions of architectural grammar, which consisted chiefly in an attempt to bring unrelated things together and force them or cozen them onto not quarreling too roughly. So he's talking about gathering all these historic elements of architecture, squishing them together and hope that they don't fight too badly. Again, I just love Sullivan's way of describing these things because it's so rich. And then the student really gets going. And he talks about no quarrel here. he talks about that one good loving look at a big tree here knocks all of that nonsense out of me. There's grammar here. He's talking about grammar in nature, in the tree, and syntax too, aplenty, and logic and function and form, and organization and rhythm and proportion, and above all, vitality, life, the harmonious expression of the divine creative energy. No quarrel here. You can bet your bottom dollar that this giant oak tree here has never stopped to inquire in its oakly soul how a pine tree grew, or a beech, or a hickory. No, sir. It has been true to its acorn from the time that acorn sprouted among the leaves it fell in, nor is it now fretting and whining because the leaves of the pine remain green, believing therefore the pine to be a superior tree. In our art, are we to follow nature's processes, nature's rhythms, because those processes, those rhythms are vital, organic, coherent, logical, above all book logic, and they flow uninterruptedly from cause to effect, that we, being greater than trees, at least we think we are, and possessed of heart, imagination, mind, and the sympathy of the mind, and above all, gifted with spiritual insight, should use those faculties to give to our art a power, a vital creative beauty that shall make with nature a harmony and not a discord. So what I love here is that you've got Sullivan and his student getting this connection, what you see at the beginning of what the student is saying here, having looked at two cities, where the purpose behind the buildings are often monotonous, he describes them. He's now getting to this idea where every building should have its individuality, should have its spirituality, should have this love of the world, and grow naturally from things, grow from the ideas, from the form and the functions, grow from that in a natural cause and effect kind of way. So we have this student here right at this precipice where the ideas are gelling in his head. He is now able to clarify what he's thinking in beautiful poetic words. And what we're going to start getting into in the very next few chapters is the language of architecture. So it's going to be a fun little ride here. And I'm going to pass it off to our resident poet.
So Sherri, that was fantastic. That was fantastic. I mean, what Sullivan keeps doing is that he's showing us that there is a spirit that human beings have, and there is a material manifestation of that spirit. Most people borrow chunks from others and put it where their spirit should be. And as a result, in matter, in material things, they produce exactly the same thing. Sullivan is able to read the matter in cities, and he's able to read the matter in the spirits. Most people actually cannot read either of them. They cannot read the cities, the works of man, and they cannot read others or themselves. They just take those pieces as themselves, which is just a conglomeration of things. In the autumn chapter, it's all about going back to the concept of the spirit and showing what a manifestation of spirit in material terms, like the oak tree, looks like. And using that as a grounding, coming back in the human realm of saying, reconnect with your spirit and create something material which is the proper manifestation of it. So it's just beautiful what he does. Thank you. Next up is Maritza.
Hi, guys. So, all of these chapters here, there is a, it's so optimistic. It kind of really is. And that's the way it looks to me. I'm going to just lightly skim over education because I know that it's going to be covered in full detail by Rupali. But I do want to say that there's a piece from the chapter in education that I feel filters through the next chapters, and it's kind of a foundational bit. And, Sullivan says, and so with our word, function, it sounds abstract, profound, but in reality, it means only that need, whatever it may be, which is seeking or finding fulfillment. And that sets us up as we move on to discuss the things like, man's power and, our personal spirituality and all the topics that both, Shrikant and Sherri have mentioned. But so that was just the one bit I wanted to share from education. And then, I have sound bites of stuff. Before we get to the cities, in man's powers, and I think it's the eminence. What I take away from those is two words that are like really heavy and deep. And one of them is curiosity, and the other one is choice. And looking at those, Sullivan is telling us that curiosity is the key to growth and change. I mean, okay, that's a really oversimplification. He says it with much prose and beauty, but that's the manner in which, I kind of break it down. And he's saying, we must ever remember the yin and yang of life. He's saying, and this filters through all the remaining chapters. There's the student speaks of cause and effect in Autumn Glory, and there's the if we acknowledge or we exult in the fact that we are powerful and we have all this power to do great, we can't do that without acknowledging that that statement cannot stand alone. It must also stand with the equal and opposite statement that we also have all this great power to do harm. And that's what I hear him saying to us and the student in the different voices. And, where one goes, so goes the other. To only consider one is a sure path towards failure. And he tells us that, the catalyst here is choice, because what makes the difference between whether you fall down one fork in the road or the other is personal choice. It is considering and maintaining a sense of the fact that personal choice, personal responsibility, and personal accountability must all walk along with you. So kind of in my head, the way I view it is we walk with shadows, and those shadows are all of these elements. And if we were to leave one behind, we're just not whole. So there's no way to find this fulfillment that we're all seeking without them. There's a little piece, I think, in the eminence chapter where he's talking about if we acknowledge and are aware that choice is something that we cannot avoid and can't get away from, then we'll learn to reweigh and revalue the eminent everywhere, in every walk of life, but specifically in our art. And that takes us back to this is like the very heart of everything, and the purpose, as I'm seeing for this book or his studies to the student, is that art is light. Our art is our bridge between that spiritual and the material that Shrikant was just explaining to us. It's the way that we can do that. You know, Ayn Rand says it's the concretization of our abstract percepts, and it all seems to mesh here. And to me, I also wrote, you know, and I wrote in my book, I put, it's an iterative process, this choice business. And then later, you know, obviously Sullivan says it far more beautifully, because he tells us all activities are utterances, all visible things are utterances. And then one asks oneself, I actually had to look up the definition for utterance, because I was wondering if I was somehow missing a definition. And I'm not. An utterance is a spoken word, a group of words. And that seems so simple and yet so profound at the same time. And he says that, and then of course he goes on and he has this like amazing poetry of how he's talking of, you know, how you are the creator, you're the poet, you're the worker, and how it all is like this symbiosis of elements within the one person to create the whole. And it's just beautiful. And he talks about this person whom he calls the Democratic Philosopher. And I mean, he says a lot. What I'm pulling out of that is he says, you know, this philosopher, this being, must find man in the innermost sanctuary of his secret thought, his elemental powers, and reveal man to himself and his kind. So I sat and thought about that for a little bit. And what I pulled out of that is that if the artist is the democratic philosopher, then art is the medium through which we can reveal a soul to itself and its kind. And then that takes me back to these concepts of imagination and thought that Sullivan has brought up to us before. The idea that in this pretty prose of the democratic philosopher, he's telling us that a lack of imagination is like a step on the path towards a perversion of power, that, you know, we lose the sense of reality. He actually states, and I don't remember which chapter, but he says, you know, it's the equivalent of a gigantic energy gone wrong. And that makes me think of running 1,000 miles in the wrong direction. Or to bringing lectures I was watching recently from Dr. Russell Akoff is, we're chasing the wrong question if we're not consciously being thoughtful and making use of the imagination within us and around us. So if we're chasing the wrong question, then the other component that is like super like hit me about these chapters is this small little sentence, and it's so profound. He writes, the voice of I will is faint. The voice of I will is faint. And when you see that all around. And to me, that is what he's saying. When he goes on for 2 chapters talking about New York and Chicago, it's not about New York. It's not about Chicago. Although I will say right now in film, he's a little harsh on New York, because I've had this lovely week playing tourist in New York, and I think it's just lovely. But that's just me, slight bias. All the same, I do understand how a city makes it easy for the individual voices to get lost. And that is visible in architecture. It's visible in art. It's visible in passersby. And it's, so if the eye gets lost, well then I was saying, I've said this, most of you probably have heard me say this before, you know, one of my favorite lines from Ayn Rand's philosophies is, in order to say I love you, first you must be able to say the I. That's what came to mind when I read this. The voice of I will is faint. And why is this a problem? Because if you cannot stand with certainty about this I will, how can you possibly do anything that would be for the improvement of yourself or your community? It all stems from this. And Sullivan goes on, he has this beautiful representation of how, it's like the equivalent of seedlings, he says, soot and murk may suffocate seedlings. So he's telling us just very basically that air is necessary for the I to flourish. It needs the fertilization that would be provided by thought and imagination. And that's, there's so much to say. I have written all over the margins of these chapters, and I don't even know, where to stop here. There's so much, but I will say that I don't believe we are greater than trees. We're not. And maybe that's a little foolishness. I do love the exuberance that the student brings in this last chapter, Autumn Glory. It is walking along a park and just, hopping from tree to tree. That's the feeling like that is conveyed here. And then just the beauty of the writing comes through. So much so that you almost have to read it again to actually get the deepness of what's being said. What hit me here is there's a question. And it says, can that which I get at secondhand go so deep as that which I receive firsthand? And that's one of those go into a corner and contemplate life questions, because it's like, okay, well, not only can I not answer that question, how do I know what's secondhand? How do I know what's firsthand? Wait, what am I doing with my life? Should I know these answers? And that's what comes to, that's what I'm thinking when I see that, right? And so I took a step back and I was like, well, maybe it's not about that. Maybe that's not as important. And he spends a lot of time talking about rhythm. And I love this concept of rhythm as cause and effect. I think it's a beautiful analogy, and it so succinctly gives that. And if you know anything of rhythm, it just fits amazingly. And so when I'm thinking of rhythm, it makes me think of, so there's a standard, 3-note rhythm that you hear in almost all Spanish music. I don't know about all, but definitely Caribbean Spanish. So especially in salsa, right? It's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, right? And that's oversimplification of the sound, but that's a very standard, and we use it for almost everything. And in Puerto Rico, it's actually done on a log with a stick. That's again, there's an official name and everything for the instrument, but that's basically what it is. And so looking at that, well, now it's easy. Now I know what's firsthand and what's secondhand. Because in rhythm, you have the strong beat and the soft beat. But you know what's most important there? That it doesn't matter. That they have their place. And so I'm going to worry less about what's firsthand or secondhand, so long as I'm aware that both exist and both need addressed. And so that's what I got out of that. And I could ramble forever, but I think that I want to hear what everyone else has to say. I'm going to leave you guys with one more beautiful line from Autumn's Glory. The power to bear apples was there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. I wanted to continue the analogy of the tree and compare it to human beings. I talked about the spirit and the material. And one of the points, Maritza, you made is about the iterative process. So the seed is the spirit. But the unique thing about man is that the material that man produces acts as the ground, acts as the soil. So it's the seed that is, so the spirit produces the material, and the material, if you make it appropriate to the spirit, will enable the spirit to grow. If you make rocks, that spirit is going to die. If you throw it in the sand, it's going to die. If you throw it in the thorns, it's going to be killed. So you need to produce something. So art for human beings has that iterative process. So and that's why Louis Sullivan gets so worked up when he looks at a bad building, because what he's saying is that that's killing spirit of people. And that is because he can read both the buildings and the people. He can see that happening. And he's saying, no, you have to make things that make the spirit grow, because then that spirit is going to produce even greater things. And that's the loop that he's focused on. And in that sense, man is a little higher than trees, because we grow our own soil. So thank you, Maritza. Next up is Rob.
Amy's good.
So I want to talk a little bit about, especially in the chapter Man's Powers, about Sullivan as a thinker in the tradition of the Enlightenment. Because it's a very Enlightenment philosopher sort of way to come in here and say, well, what is human nature? What are man's powers? What are the capacities and abilities that human beings have? And then construct a philosophy based out of that. I think a while back, Sherri, you had Brad Thompson on here talking about his book, America's Revolutionary Mind. And when I've been reading that, one of the things that has popped out in my mind there has been the extent to which the founding fathers, as people coming out of this Enlightenment tradition, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment tradition, when they talk about politics, when they talk about the controversies of the day, they would always start with, well, here's what human nature is, and here's what man is supposed to be doing, and man in the state of nature, and going back to these first principles about what kind of entity a human being is. They didn't start with, well, is that a reasonable rate for a stamp tax? And do we have some academic studies on that to show, or public opinion surveys to show what people think about it? No, they would always go back to the basic principles of what is the nature of man? What are man's powers or capacities? What is he supposed to be doing here on this earth? And then that's the basis for, and then what is the purpose of government within the context of that? And that's the basis for everything they do. And we've gone very much the opposite. I mean, I read about politics for a living. I can tell you, we are very much the opposite of that right now in the way we approach politics. Everything begins in midstream. It begins with a very concrete question or controversy or something outrageous somebody said on Twitter, what have you. And people don't go back to the basic questions of, what is man? What kind of being is man? What are we supposed to be doing with our lives? What is the whole purpose of life? And building something, a view of building our views of what we should be doing culturally and politically based on that. So I just want to read a little of the section here of where he does that. He takes this idea of, let's start with the very basics of what kind of thing, what kind of entity is a human being. Therefore, as to his physical nature, man has the power of locomotion, of muscular control, the power to select and manipulate other things, other objects, to surmount obstacles. Therefore is he by nature a wanderer, a toiler, a worker, an artisan, an artist. For these things mean the power to do, to create. As to his mental nature, man has the urging power of curiosity. Hence, he is again a wanderer, an explorer, a seeker, an inquirer, a scientist. He wishes to know the how. Hence, his power to do is increased by his knowledge how to do. His art is strengthened and amplified by its power, by his science. Furthermore, man's curiosity wishes to discern the why. Still a wanderer, a seeker, a worker, a thinker, he pushes his power of inquiry into new paths. He becomes a philosopher. His thus acquired knowledge of the why increases his power over the how, and hence his power to do, which means a progressive accumulating growth in solidarity. His philosophy, his science, his art mutually strengthen each other. Thus, man, the worker, the inquirer, the thinker, becomes ever more unitary in the exercise of his powers. He becomes the greater worker. And then he goes on to add to this the emotional and imaginative aspects and essentially the power of choice. It says, man is a moral being, a power of enormous momentum. It is the power to choose, the central power of the ego. And he concludes by saying, and thus is his growth, his unfolding, his self-centralization. Man, the worker, becomes man, the creator. So this is his whole starting point, is let's go back and talk about what kind of a being man is. And so very much in the spirit of the Enlightenment. I would say it's also a little bit in the spirit of Aristotle, because I remember Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics begins with saying that with this idea of human beings pursuing all these different courses and having the power to pursue all these different courses of action and all these different goals, and then the good being that at which all things aim. So it's very much the idea of looking at what is human nature, what are the human powers and capacities, and then saying, therefore, we should try to actualize that human capacity, and everything should be built around actualizing that. And he picks away at that idea throughout here, but I think the thing that sums up this idea of man having these capacities and the power of and the physical capacities, then the mental capacities, and the psychological and spiritual capacities, combined with the power of choice. He has a phrase here where he talks about what sums up democracy for him is the idea of spiritual freedom with responsibility. And I think specifically in the artistic context, in the context of art and architecture, spiritual freedom means the ability to throw off or the ability to create something new based on direct observation of nature. And I think it's interesting, he uses the word feudal, not in a political sense or in an economic sense, but in a cultural sense. That feudalism is this idea of knowledge and education coming from status. That the idea that you go back and find what is a great or respected or authority figure, and you take everything from the authority figure. And I think that's what he means by feudalism. Mm-hmm. And it's the lack of spiritual freedom that he means by feudalism. So the idea that you are oppressed or you are under the thumb always of some prior intellectual or spiritual authority figure. And then you were just following from that or borrowing the authority of this authority figure by repeating it. And the idea of spiritual freedom as being you are observing reality directly and coming up with new ideas based on that. And that's why I think we get down. That brings us to where we go with this idea of the out of doors of the spirit. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're going out into the forest, right? Because we suddenly, it says, that's the line here in Autumn Glory where he says, the student, by the way, is saying this now. He says, can that which I get at secondhand go so deep as that which I receive at firsthand? And now, of course, if you've read The Fountainhead, you get bells going off. Like, wait a minute, is it firsthand versus secondhand? This is where she's getting this. But specifically, he's talking about books when he says this, about getting things from books. And that's what he means by this feudalism of the spirit is you have authority figures as summed up in books that are there in the library that are handed to you that you're supposed to read. And you're getting things from the books from the authority figures, as opposed to getting them firsthand by going out into nature. And that's, I think, what he means by the out of doors of the spirit, is that instead of being cloistered in this little library where you're absorbing the authorities, you're going out and directly encountering nature one-on-one. Again, it's a very Enlightenment era idea of the, okay, so I've mentioned before that in Italy, in Florence, there's this Vasari corridor, which links, starts in the Palazzo Vecchio, goes to the Uffizi Gallery, and then goes to the Prince's Palace across the river. And they turned it into this gallery that has artist self-portraits. And it was just fascinating because each era you get an idea of what the artist thinks of himself, of the artist and his role in society. And I remember when you get to the 18th century and you're in the middle of the Enlightenment, there's this one particular painting, a German painter, I think it was, who paints himself sort of in this sort of simple 18th century garb, not, very relatively unornamented compared to like the 17th century with the ribbons and the medals and things like that. He's just, he's in simple clothing, and he's out on a mountainside wandering through nature, observing nature. Right? This is very much in the spirit of the Enlightenment, and you can see that in their art. And that's why he has us going out of doors, because it's the out of doors of the experience of the spirit, of the idea of man in the state of nature, man directly encountering nature and learning from it directly without the intervention of authorities and books. Two other notes. So I think that's what really struck me is in this section of chapters is how infused he was with that sort of Enlightenment spirit and Enlightenment ideas, and that approach of the Enlightenment, starting with human nature and the direct encounter between man and nature. Two other notes I want to put here is that he uses the phrase dudishness in here. I just had to mention that because it's one of these fascinating examples. It's one of these fascinating examples of how words change. Because exactly, we think of the word dude, we think Southern California surfer guy, like, dude, I was out there catching some big waves, and dudishness at that time meant more like foppishness. It meant I looked it up. It means like attentiveness to appearance and sort of fastidiousness and being overdressed and overgroomed and too concerned about how you look. That's what he means by dudishness here. But again, it's one of these words that has changed rather dramatically in its meaning and connotations. But I also want to get to the fact that we have the Oakley soul here, and Sherri read the thing about the Oakley soul.
That's the second time I've read it in this group so far.
Yes, I know, and that's one of our favorite things about the oak never inquiring. And it's Oakley soul, how a pine tree grew. And what fascinates me about this is that not till I got to reading it this time that I realized it's the student who says that. Because it's not all clear. Well, you may have told me that, but it's not all clearly marked. So when you go through, when you just get this out of context, it's hard to tell who's saying it. Is it Sullivan saying this or somebody else? Yeah. It's the student saying it. And I think that's really an interesting sort of breakthrough, that the student becomes very eloquent and very detailed and very self-generating in terms of ideas at this point. Right, so that's what I had to mention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. And Rob, I really like your observation about the feudalism, and you're absolutely right, because he always thinks about inside out. He's always saying that this is how the human spirit is, and this is what it is going to produce in material terms. Just like he does that in architecture, he does the same thing in political and social systems. That's his way of thinking about the outside. So he's saying the problem with feudalism is not that there are these external social, political, feudal systems that are oppressing you. He's saying the problem is that it is there in your mind. Your spirit is feudal. People's spirit is feudal. Therefore, feudalism exists and is sustained outside. So it is very much of a kind of epistemological, spiritual, will issue. It is a psychological issue. So it's like psychological feudalism. It's the epistemological feudalism. It is the spiritual feudalism. And he's seeing the feudalism outside as just the manifestation of it. And moment anybody loses that inside, he has the capacity to keep changing the outside. And so that's a great point. Thank you. Next up is Joia.
I'm really glad I'm coming after Rob this time, because I definitely want to talk a lot about this idea of man's powers and pick up on a lot of what Rob said. But first, I do want to weigh in on this issue of humans versus trees that Maritza brought up. This just reminds me, one of my earliest memories being a child, maybe one of my first philosophical thoughts, I remember sitting in my car seat as a very young child, looking out at a beautiful dogwood tree and thinking that the tree was so beautiful, but I was glad that I was born a human being. being. And while I still would agree with that assessment, I have to say there are definitely things that trees have over us. And especially from an adult perspective, when we recognize that the trees are essentially our cousins, that we all share a common ancestor way back with the blue-green algae, there are ways that the trees definitely have it over us. So, just three things. I mean, one, just the fact that trees can live much longer than any human being can. I think they've definitely got us beat there. The way that trees are so self-sufficient. We have to eat trees or the fruit from trees or the animals that prey on the trees. And even just, in terms of pain management, we need the ginkgos. The ginkgos, they produce it all themselves. So they're way more self-sufficient than we are. And then, of course, this third issue that, of course, you never see oak trees trying to become pine trees. So they never make the mistakes that humans are. So just three ways perhaps that the trees definitely have it over us.
Let's pause for a second, because I don't want to, just beat up on trees. But let me do that one last time, and then I'll have Maritza Maritza respond. See, the difference is that trees have had the evolution, millions of years of evolution to perfect their form. And if you look at time, okay, and if you speed up time, what is happening is that we are living beings who are living much, 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 much faster than trees. And we are producing all kinds of junk in the process. So we look messy. Now, trees also did that, okay? But most of the junk is almost like 99.9999999% of the junk has become extinct, because the only thing that went forward was the thing that was beautiful, ones that kind of matched the seeds, matched their particular context. So therefore, when you look at a tree, you have an impact of beauty. So in one sense, we are better because we are faster. We're trying out many things, and we are seeing the products of all that trial and error in us. In one sense, you can look at trees as an ideal, because what would it look like if your creation had the same power of having arrived at a solution that was as good as millions of years of evolution? That's what the tree, when you look up to a tree, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing what it would look like. And then that is an inspiring thing for you, because you're saying, I have to work my mind hard enough that I can approach the tree. Sorry, Maritza, I'm going to have you, you've been beating up on trees. Please, go ahead. Would you like to respond? You're on mute.
I have not been beating up on trees. And I see that perspective. I do. I think that we also don't have the impact. We just don't have the impact that trees have. And that's why I question whether or not we're greater than trees. It's like, I don't know. And just think the stories they could tell. I'm with Joia. We don't have the longevity to possibly fathom. Like, if trees could talk, if you've ever walked through a forest, like I've been in the mountains of Seattle, where these trees are like, you're but a speck. I mean, they have branches of these redwoods they're so unbelievably huge. It's like, you cannot help but ponder the insignificance of your entire being and species when you're looking at this other being and species. So I don't know, anyone who tells me that they think they're greater than a tree, you just haven't found the right tree.
Beautiful. Thank you. Next up is Joia.
Okay. So back to our regularly scheduled programming and this part of Kindergarten Chats. So people probably know I love looking at the story of Kindergarten Chats, but today I actually want to start where we ended today with Autumn Glory and work our way back to man's power. And then I know Rupali is going to say a lot about education, and I'm sure she has so much to say about education, but I really want to I want to start with Autumn Glory and then kind of see what it shows us as we work our way back to man's powers. And just to kind of recap again where we are in the story, Sherri's been really good at pointing out to us that we've been following that there are going to be ultimately these 4 out-of-door scenes that are these significant pivotal points in the student's development. So we had the summer scene where the student perhaps first comes to life, has that first-handed experience with nature and comes to life. But then afterwards, we saw that he reached the high, but then kind of there was a chapter about revulsion that kind of reached a low point again. And now we've been kind of working through these middling chapters, and now we come to this next out of doors scene, and I love the way this ends, and the phrase that both, well, I think Sherri and Maritza and Rob all picked out that I love here, this idea of the out of doors of spirit, and what it is the student says here at the very end of this chapter. He says here, "For there has come to my understanding never to depart from it a clean and a wholesome sense of what you mean by the out of doors of the spirit." So I think that's just a significant point to recognize that he got something in that first outdoors experience. And now in Autumn Glory, we've circled back, we've had another out of doors experience, and now he's really captured it in a way that he's going to be able to hold on to it. And so now we're going to see, once he's had this, what's going to happen next. But then I here just wanted to share some of this description of the out of doors, just because it is so important to what the student is experiencing here. And so in this chapter here, the student says, "It is all so clear, so transparent in the mind here, as we stroll in the nipping, bracing air, just tinged with the last warmth of summer's winsomely departing smile, with the brown and the pied leaves just beginning to gather a little underfoot. As we walk through this stately grove, the rugged trunks and the branches far uplifted, seeming so stern yet kindly, and wondering, one might almost say, why we have come here among them, and over all, through the openings, the brilliant blue and cloudless sky, and the view now and then of the valley and the river below, and the gorgeously crowned opposing range of hills, brilliant here, but moving and undulating away until far off they pass into a thin, delicate haze, which little by little deepens into purple, and all so still, so silent under the softening sun, so wonderfully calm, so majestic, so content. The spread of it exalts and overpowers me. And when I think that this is but a little part of it all, takes a new hold upon me, and the splendor, the beauty, the serenity of nature's moods and rhythms comes to me more and more, and my thoughts go out as upon wings, far and far and far over the land. For is this not the gorgeous heralding of winter? Is this not his breath from the far north? Is not this the vast subsidence of summer's wave of power, its ineffable declension, its exquisitely balanced modulation from moving into quiescent life? And then just to go down a little farther, he says, can that which I get at second hand go so deep as that which I receive at first hand? That which I receive copiously in far-flung abundance, in abundance underfoot, overhead, round and about and near at hand. It is all coming near and clear to me what you mean by the out of doors of the spirit. Hereafter, great nature's out of doors shall be my temple, far, far more beautiful, more holy than the temple of the Roman or the Greek. And now and hereafter will I worship therein, and in the great out of doors of the oceans and lands of the world, of my own land and my own people, shall my spirit freely move, as a breeze through the forests and through the sky, by the light of the sun and the light of the stars, over land and sea, over river and plain. It's to me just a beautiful description. And it even led to me a question that I started thinking about this time that I would love to hear everyone else on the call's views about, because what struck me this time reading this was the sense of nature, of the expanse of nature, and what it must have been like back in this time, in the time of the founding fathers, when America really was a frontier. And there really was that sense of nature and the sense of expanse. And I'm curious people's thoughts of how much that really matters for freedom. It got me thinking, even in our own modern context, it feels to me like today, even the states that are most free are states like Texas and Colorado that still have this sense of the expanse of nature, and how much that might be necessary for freedom and for Louis Sullivan's democracy. So that was just a question that I had reading through this time. Now, as we go back, as everyone's kind of pointed out, we went through where we did the survey of the two cities. And there was one thing I wanted to point out in this chapter that's called the survey, where I think Louis Sullivan says something just really brilliant about both solitude and the busyness of the city. And so he has this real description of how you need both and what the function of each of them is. So he talks about here that so for while the great cities are great battlegrounds, they are not great breeding grounds. The great minds may go to the great cities, but they are not, generally speaking, born and bred in the great cities. In the formation of a great mind, a simple mind, a mastermind, solitude is prerequisite. For such a mind is nurtured in contemplation and strengthened in it, in the quiet, in the silence, alone with itself and nature, and alone with the subtly interchanging influences and aspirations of nature and of self, it grows. And it grows because it is undisturbed. And then going on, that the country, the out of doors, is the prime source of power. And the city, the arena in which the power is dissipated for good or ill. Or to broaden the view, that nature is the true source of all power of the heart and the spirit, and likewise the source of the power of the great cities. And I love this view too. And then he goes on and to give a more nuanced view and to say that, yes, of course, in the city, you can have solitude. And to me, that was always a very interesting experience as someone who started out in the suburbs and then moved to the city. It's always been my experience that the two places where you actually have the most solitude are when you are alone in nature or alone in the city. There is a way when you can be in the city surrounded. For me, this is like you're literally in the center of Times Square with, I mean, not now during the pandemic, but before, so many people, it's, a throng of people, but when you're really there by yourself, perhaps just watching everyone, having it all around you, you really do have the experience of being alone. And sometimes I think that the suburb is the worst place to be. It's like you need the poles and you need both, but anything that tries to be a halfway point, you get none of either. But I love this idea that we need, both the solitude and the city, and this idea that we go to nature, we go to solitude to develop our powers. And then once we have our powers, we want to come to the city and interact with other people. And they have that line about the ambition. This is where our ambition comes, and we match it up with other people. And so I love that thought. So now we're going to move back to the descriptions of Chicago and New York. And I have to say, I don't really know much about Chicago. I was hoping maybe Sherri and Rob were going to say something, or even Shrikant, because they've all lived there. But I do have something that I have to say about New York. And Maritza and Ash are already perhaps kind of getting to this. This is their trip to New York City. But this time around, it really struck me how Louis Sullivan was writing this before the Empire State Building, before the Chrysler Building, before Rockefeller Center, and certainly before the World Trade Center and the Freedom Tower. So he has this line here where he says about New York is old, its sins are fixed, the damage is done. And it occurred to me what a tragedy that he died in 1918, I think. So if he had literally lived maybe just a decade longer, he could have lived to see the regrowth of New York, all the iconic buildings, the tall, soaring, proud, noble structures that we all think of when we think of New York, he wasn't able to experience. And it was really poignant to me now, because in my experience right now after the pandemic, we are at a low point of New York City's history. But reading this reminded me that the thing about New York is that New York is always new. At least that's been its history. That the good people of the world come to New York, just like Maritza and Ash, who I think are demonstrating that for us in person today. The good people, they come to New York, and New York has this history of revitalization, and hopefully there will be the new flourishing of New York City. So I just had to say that about my favorite city. And then if we're working back, we're going to go back to the chapter on eminence that both Sherri and Maritza talked about really so beautifully here. And I even wanted to pick up where Maritza started talking about this idea of the democratic philosopher and who is the democratic philosopher. And I wanted to read this passage where Louis Sullivan goes into depth about who the democratic philosopher is. And he says, in short, this democratic philosopher, he must search for man. He must find man in the innermost sanctuary of his secret thought, his elemental powers, and reveal man to himself and to his kind. It has never been done. It is the great immediate task. Current ideas concerning democracy are so vague, and current notions concerning man's power so shapeless, that the man who shall clarify and define, who shall interpret, create, and proclaim in the image of democracy's fair self, will be the destined man of the hour, the man of all time. The world is yearning for such a man as for a Messiah. The huge world of men, women, offspring, unstable, drifting, dreaming, dumb, a purblind world, an uneasy, aching world, suffering in torment of soul for lack of the one single shining idea toward which they might look as toward a glorious star rising serenely above the horizon of their long, futile night, and toward which their hearts might turn. And when I read that, it makes me think of another one of Louis Sullivan's books, which is The Autobiography of an Idea. And I want to say right now, I want to suggest that when we finish with Kindergarten Chats, I think we should definitely go forth and read in full The Autobiography of an Idea. So the title is called The Autobiography of an Idea. And I think you have to ask, what is the idea that is the autobiography of an idea? So last time I missed when we were at the museum, but I caught up that Shrikant suggested that the idea is form follows function. And I realized, I think ultimately Shrikant and I will agree, but I think along the way we are going to disagree, because I realized that if you would ask me, what is the idea of an autobiography of an idea? I would say the idea is the idea of power, man's powers. That, to me, that is what this book is all about. And it builds up, in my view, in reading, to a chapter that is called Face to Face, which is already this answer of man revealing himself to man. I like to think that if in Kindergarten Chats here, Louis Sullivan is calling for a kind of new Messiah, that in Autobiography of an Idea, he's almost kind of the John the Baptist figure. And he does a lot to point us to the way of what is man. So in exactly the way that Rob was pointing out that Rob pointed out this kind of Enlightenment tradition of going back to these first principles, of asking, what is man? And Louis Sullivan has so many important and wonderful and beautiful things to say about what is man. And ultimately, I know I started this with talking about the trees, but I think even my first young childhood impression that I was glad to be born a human being is ultimately the correct one. And it is for all the reasons, for all the man's powers that Louis Sullivan illuminates for us. And so I wanted to read from Autobiography of an Idea, and I realized that when I wanted to talk about what Louis Sullivan says about man's powers, that there was probably at least like 15 to 20 pages in this book that I wanted to read. So hopefully we can all go through and read it together. But I did then, it was very hard. I tried to pull out just 3 little pieces that I wanted to read and share. And hopefully it's a tease. And then hopefully then we can all read this book together, and then everyone can think for themselves and come up with their own answer to what is the idea of Autobiography of an Idea. So three passages here that I just had to share from this book about man's powers. So here, Louis Sullivan says, to begin, he is a worker and a wanderer in various ways. With his bodily powers, he may go here and there. He may move objects about. He may change the order of things. Here at the onset, we find a portentous power, the power to change situations. He can make new situations. With 10 fingers, he can do wonderful things, make things he needs, make accessory things to extend his muscular powers. Thus, he manipulates. He further changes situations. He changes his own situations. He creates an environment of his own. One sees here the adventurer, the craftsman, the doer, ever growing in power. Thus, man's first collective power within himself is the power to aspire, to work, to wander, to go from place to place, near and far, to return to his home. Now comes into view that power we call curiosity, and coupled with it, the power to inquire. Man's power to inquire we call a mental power, to distinguish it from his somatic power. It may have had a beginning, it can have no end. The result of inquiry we call knowledge. Its high objective we call science. The objective of science is more knowledge, more power, more inquiry, more power. Now, if to man to do we added the power to inquire, man the worker grows visibly more compact in power, more potent to change situations and to make new situations for himself. The situation may be a deep gorge in a wilderness. The new situation shows a bridge spanning the chasm in one great leap. Thus it is that man himself, as it were, leaps the chasm through the adventurous coordination of his power to inquire and his power to do. And thus the natural man ever enlarges his range of beneficence. His life experiences are real. He reverses the dictum, I think, therefore I am. It becomes in him, I am, therefore I inquire and I do. There's more, but I want to go to another one. Let us go on. There is another power in man. That power is moral. Its name is choice. Within this one word, choice, lies the story of man's world. It stands for the secret poise within him. It reveals as a flashlight all his imagings, his fantasies, his willful thoughts, his deeds, from the greatest to the least, even in the gliding hour we call today. This one word, choice, stands for the sole and single power. It is the name of the mystery that lies behind the veil of all human appearances. A word that dissolves the enigma of men's deeds. A word, a light that not only illuminates all his obvious works, all the inner springs and motives of his civilizations, but a light whose rays reach within the sanctuary of the secret thought of each and all, thus revealing the man of the past and the man of today, starkly in personal status as a social factor of beneficence or woe. Need we know man's thoughts? View his works, his deeds. They tell his choice. And one more passage. The free spirit is the spirit of joy. It delights to create in beauty. It is unafraid. It knows not fear. It declares the earth to be its home and the fragrance of earth to be its inspiration. It is strong. It is mighty in beneficence. It views its powers with emotions of adventure. Humility it knows not. It dreams a civilization like unto itself. It would create such a world for mankind. It has the strength. It sees the strength of the fertile earth, the strength of the mountains, the valleys, the far-spreading plains, the vast seas, the rivers and the rivulets, the great sky as a wondrous dome, the sun in its rising, its zenith and its setting, and the night. It glories in these powers of earth and sky as in its own. It affirms itself integral with them all. It sees life at work everywhere. Life, the mysterious, the companionable, the ineffable, the immensest and gentlest of powers, clothing the earth in a pattern of radiant sublimity, of tenderness, of fairy delicacy, ceaselessly at work. Thus, the free spirit feels itself to be likewise clothed as with a flowing shoulder garment, symbol of a power akin to the fluent mystery and fecundity of life. Thus it moves in the open with vision clear. Thus is man, the wonder worker, bound up in friendship with the wonder worker life. And that's just your tease. So hopefully we all want to read this book together. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joia. That was wonderful. That's one of my favorite passages from that book, parts of the book. But I have to disagree with you, because what you're describing, what he's describing as man's powers, is the structure of the function of man. But he's saying something more than that. It is not just saying that these are the powers of man, or these are the functions of man. There is a hierarchy of functions. That's what he's putting down here. What he's saying is more than that. He's saying that it's not enough just to understand a function of a thing. You need to see how these are manifested in forms. And the forms that these functions create have an impact, iterative impact. So he's explaining, the functions explain the nature of man. His idea of form follows function goes beyond that. It rests on the concept of function of man, but it is trying to explain all of civilization, everything that man creates, the positive impact and the negative impact created by the forms we create. So that's why that is the core idea, of which the detailed idea of function of man is a subpart. Because what it does is that with form follows function, he explains not only the seed, which is the man, but the entire forest of how these seeds interact with one another and what are the intermediate products through which they interact, having both positive and negative impact. So that's what, but I definitely want, so I'm definitely game for doing the autobiography idea. What about Rob and Sherri? Sherri?
I'm resigned to the fact that I will never do yard work on a Saturday afternoon again.
Okay, good.
I was just telling him this is so much better than book club.
Maritza, what do you say?
Better than a book club that I was last in.
Maritza, what do you say? Yeah, okay. All right, so next up is Rupali.
So as everyone has pointed out, this section ends with a very optimistic view. And in this, Louis Sullivan also hints towards what the future can be and what he predicts the future to be of society and humans living together. So the thing that I want to start off with is the idea of democracy. We talked about it last time, but I want to talk about it a little bit more, where he talks about man's spirit, democracy being man's spirit and man standing on his own feet. Now, in an evolutionary time frame, if we look at that moment when man was able to stand on 2 feet and look up and look forward, that was huge in terms of evolution. And he's talking about it metaphorically too, that, that instance of standing on 2 feet helps man look forward and do things. He's also talking about the physical aspect of man, which Rob and Joia both read those passages, so I'm not going to read that again. But he also talks about man standing morally on his own feet. And he talks about development of character and conduct, that those are important elements of man's powers. So, taking from that, he takes us through this journey of, if we understand what democracy means, of what he means as democracy, and then what kind of education will support that democracy or that individualism, the nourishment and the flourishing of that individual. From there, he takes us into looking more deeply at what makes us a human, what makes a man. And all these 3 chapters relate very well with Maria Montessori's idea of the formation of man. So I would recommend the book, The Formation of Man by Maria Montessori, because she talks very similarly about these ideas. And Maria Montessori also talks a lot about, the metaphor or analogy of a gardener and the soil, the fertile soil, the seed, She uses it pretty much similarly, but she also says, let us study man as a scientist in formation of man. So I'm just going to share here. Let's see. So Maria Montessori talks about what is the potential of the human being, and we see that, give me just 1 second there, trying to adjust this. She's talking about what is the potential of the individual child, and in these 3 chapters, Louis Sullivan is also talking about what is the potential of the human being. So, one of the things that Maria Montessori says is, behind the cultivator, however, stands the scientist who scrutinizes the secrets of nature. So we've seen through this these chapters that Louis Sullivan is taking the student on a journey and taking him to understand the basic workings of nature. And here, Maria Montessori is saying pretty much the same thing, that we are part of nature, and if science began to study man, it would not only succeed in offering new techniques for the education of children and the young, it would further lead to a profound understanding of many human and social phenomena that are still enveloped in obscurity. So what Louis Sullivan is saying is, we haven't yet reached that the form that the function of humans is yet. And to get there, we have to follow the laws of nature. Now, Maria Montessori also talks about the laws of nature and the laws that humans make. So we make laws for our physical environment, but there are laws that already exist. Now, if you look at the laws, and we've talked about the oakley soul of the oak, when we look at what is the manliness of man, so to say, right? What makes us that human? So what are those values that are universal to humans, whether we are in India, Europe, Africa, America? And Maria Montessori says, it really doesn't matter where you are. She says, in order that the human personality may achieve its independence, we have to offer means to deliver the human personality from the oppression of age-old prejudices regarding education. Human personality belongs to all human beings. These concerns and affect the humans of all nations. So here she's talking about universally, humans are the same. And one of the things that she talks about, and Louis Sullivan talks about, are, holding man in high regard. This is very unique. I think very unique for Louis Sullivan. We see that with Ayn Rand. We see that with Maria Montessori. Very few people hold humans in that high regard. And why is that? So thinking about a human being as a person who can think for themselves, as a person who can conduct themselves morally correct, their behavior and their thinking. And both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about the spiritual law that humans follow. So I think in those ways, Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan are very similar. One of the things that Louis Sullivan says in his essay about democracy, he says, democracy is a vast, slow-urging impulse which little by little and more broadly is ever exalting man in spirit and imparting him the definition of his true image, his true powers. And Maria Montessori in Formation of Man says very similarly about human beings. So then it, so if you look at the education of human beings. So what does it mean? And Louis Sullivan talks about the infinite creative spirit as the function. Maria Montessori talks about the spiritual embryo of the child, the human being. So one of the things that both Montessori and Louis Sullivan do in the chapter of democracy. So Louis Sullivan talks about Nazarene, and he refers to the biblical texts, and so does Maria Montessori in the formation of man. She talks about the Old Testament, where the man is born as an adult, and then in the New Testament, man is born as a child. And that was very interesting for me to kind of see. Now, some of the things that Maria Montessori talks about is, moving from concrete lessons about nature. She talks about using nature in the classroom and outside for children to learn from nature. And Louis Sullivan is leading this student in the same concrete lessons to form the abstract idea of democracy. And from this, both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about a social order that would form if we understand nature. So let me just find a passage from Form Follows Function. One of the things that Maria Montessori talks about also is individualism and why each child is an individual. So when we talk about the oak being oak tree and not worried about the pine tree and not competing with another tree, every child is unique, every human being is unique. And she talks similarly as Louis Sullivan. She says, they seek as their greatest good what they call democracy. That is, that the people may give their opinion as to how they are to be ruled, that they may cast their votes at elections. What irony to choose one's rulers, but those who rule cannot free anybody from the chains which bind us all, which render all activity and initiative futile and render them helpless to save themselves. So she's saying, okay, here we are talking about democracy in the form of a government, but really, if you cannot free yourself, if you cannot think for yourself, if you cannot do for yourself, then that democracy really doesn't serve the purpose. And Louis Sullivan is talking about, similarly, that democracy is of the individual. And so Maria Montessori says, man must gather together all his values and energies. He must develop them and prepare himself for his liberation. This is not the time to fight each other, to try and subdue each other. We must consider man alone and strive to raise him up, to strip him of useless bonds he creates for himself. And then here is the talk about the feudalism that Louis Sullivan also talks about in his work. So, another thing that Maritza, you had pointed out was the yin and yang of human beings. When we talked about the OODA loop, I think Chet Richards had mentioned the Cheng and the Chi. And I think one of the things that Louis Sullivan says, everything has a simple basis. Our self-imposed task is thus to seek out the simple. And it's, there is the material form, and what we are looking for is, so that's the Cheng, and the Chi is, what we're looking for is the spiritual aspect of it. Now, throughout this chapter on education, Louis Sullivan talks about the function of humans is, only that we are seeking fulfillment, right? And only that which we are seeking for fulfillment. And so what is that fulfillment? In the formation of man, Maria Montessori talks about valorization of man and what that means. So according to Maria Montessori, the valorization means a human being who can use his intellect, who can use his physical powers to create, who can fit in socially, who can work with a moral sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And she believes that children can achieve this level by middle school. And we see that, by middle school, they are able-bodied human beings who can participate meaningfully in education, in society. But when we look around us, that's really not the case that we see with many of the students. And Louis Sullivan is saying exactly the same thing in his book, that, okay, you've gone to architecture school, but really you've not been to kindergarten. And so here are the kindergarten chats, right? So kindergarten is gardens of children, where children are happy. And instead of the cruel tyranny of schools, Maria Montessori says that we cultivate children, we cultivate nature in the way nature's meant to be. And so why was this book necessary for Louis Sullivan is because modern education or current education, well, modern education at that time, current education now, it hasn't really changed much. And I was really surprised to see how many obstacles there are in, as both Maria Montessori or Louis Sullivan, and even now we try to implement these ideas, that there are so many obstacles in the way. Well, we've talked about the powers of man. I think Joia and Rob have done a fantastic job. I just want to highlight again, the moral being a creation with infinite creative spirit that Louis Sullivan talks about, and Maria Montessori talks as the spiritual embryo, a person who can think, who can use their power, who can dream, who can think of what the world can be, and a creator. So having said this, what is the function of man? And to be able to create a social structure. So Louis Sullivan talks about, creating, he says, the determining power of all man's power, let us briefly examine this power in order to clarify a shaping of the conception of democracy, of democratic art and democratic education. Well, what is the human personality and where does it begin? When does a man become a living thing? And if we look at the stages of human development, we can see how from childhood to adulthood, we all go through different phases. And if we can have an education system based on that, then we can have a human being who can work in harmony with his values, with art and science. And so a human being who can work with thought, with independent thought and conduct, and create his social order. So we've talked about, the manifestation of our ideas into our physical world, and then trial and error and coming back to it. So that brings us to eminence and leaders. And the way I look at the parallels in the formation of man and in Maria Montessori's book and Louis Sullivan, in her book, she has a chapter called Prejudices and Obstacles. And the thing that Louis Sullivan is talking about in this case is why are these people so vacant? If these are our leaders, why are they so vacant? Should not they know what the human potential is? And Maria Montessori says, first they're blinded by prejudice. So let me read a few passages from her book. That prejudice which forbids us to believe the extraordinary, the fear of being thought credulous, which is felt by those who wish to uphold their dignity and cultural superiority is common to all. So there is this underlying feeling of status and, I am better than you, or all of those underlying beliefs. Now, Maria Montessori, she had her school, she would have the children in different parts of the world. She was in India, she was in Europe, she was, and she was doing her experiments. People in different parts of the world were doing the same experiments that she was doing. And everywhere they found that the children were working very quiet, peacefully. I'll read a passage about how she describes the children's work. Here among these children, order came from the mysterious, hidden inner directives, which can manifest themselves only if freedom permitting them to be heeded is given. In order to give this type of freedom, it was precisely necessary that nobody interfere to obstruct the constructive spontaneity of the activity of the children in an environment prepared so that their need for development could find satisfaction. So the thing is that it was so simple that just follow the child, follow the nature of human beings. And yet, because the people, we are blinded by centuries of ideas of what a child is, even today, we don't believe, many people don't believe what they see. They feel that, oh, this is just an off case. Maybe this child is really very gifted. And no, they're not gifted. Every child has this gift. Every child has that seed. It just needs that fertile land to flourish and somebody to nurture it. So she said, it's right in front of our eyes, and I could see it. And here let me see, in one of the chapters, Louis Sullivan says to, Louis Sullivan, okay, this is in Our City. He says, are your eyes veiled? Are your ears sealed? Have you lost to mind the bounty, fertility, chastity, strength, the beauty, the mobility, the serenity of nature? Have you forsaken the yearnings of your heart? And where is your imagination, my laddie? Where are your eyes? Where are your thoughts? And the thing is that Maria Montessori is asking the same questions in the formation of man. She is saying, it's all before our eyes. I am not doing any magic. These children are just doing the work that they're meant to do because the environment has been created for them to just thrive, to seek what they need, and they will work within that. So that was very interesting that, both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan see the same prejudices or obstacles in human nature. The other thing that Maria Montessori was often told, this is way too optimistic, the children doing their own work, because back then the idea was that a child is, the child was not even considered as a part of the social structure. They were just there and the adults did everything. So for people to say, okay, the child can actually do things, the child can actually create, the child can actually think, it was too much. And they were like, maybe this is way too optimistic, this cannot happen. And so that, again, a mental barrier was there. The other thing that she talks about is, and I see this even now in education, that people will say, well, they can do one language, or they can do just math, but let's take away geometry. Oh, they can do language, let's take away grammar, and let's not do cursive writing, that's too hard for them. And so by taking away elements of rich education, or let's not do classical literature, that's old language, or whatever reasons, by simplifying the curriculum, by making it so simple, it is so dry and boring for the children that really education has no value at that point for students. And then you can see children being disengaged, children being anxious, children being depressed. You see all of that in modern day education. And I'm surprised, that this is talked about 150 years ago and it still exists. That mental inertia, and both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about that mental inertia for humans to change, to create a new form of education. So that's that. And so kind of in the closing, what is an ideal man then? And in his chapter, let me just find it. Louis Sullivan says in Man's Power, in Eminence, I'm sorry. So such man must have both vision and sympathy. Within his spirit must ride the powers of a worker, inquirer, thinker, dreamer, prophet, of artist, philosopher, metaphysician, which all in condensation shall organize and propel the utterance of the world's great poet yet to come. And so what is an ideal man? And if we can find the opportunities, they exist, and find where they are and give them the opportunity. In education, there's so much we can do to nurture that spirit. Maria Montessori calls it the human potential. And in the closing of the Autumn Glory, Louis Sullivan, and I think all of us have talked about this, but the power to bear apples was there. And so there is the human potential. And how do we nurture that human potential? So Maria Montessori has another book called The Human Potential. And, I'll end with this one statement from Louis Sullivan: of such is the colossal power of passion. So I think both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan are talking about the same nature of humans, the spirit that we've talked about, and how education needs to be changed for a new civilization. And Louis Sullivan refers to that with this new civilization, new education, with the idea that there's a lot to learn from nature, we can create a new civilization. And he lays out what the future holds. So in a survey where they are now looking deeply into, so that the student has moved along, he has learned, he's transformed, he has gone through the ups and downs, and he has come to a point where he can really focus and dig deeper into the inquiry. And now in the survey, he's saying, Louis Sullivan says, it may be a premature prediction, but I will say this to you now, that here on the soil where we are will arise the greatest race of creative artists in history, creative minds in every walk of life. And I predict it on the soil, the waters and the air, and on the spirit of democracy, which has mated and shall fully mate with them. Democracy and the open air of serene continent shall bring forth the superb race, and the eminent, the thinkers, poets, artists of that race, in turn shall bring forth in their works that which the urge of democracy and luxuriantly vital continent have imparted to them and to the people. But I anticipate, so eager am I to build.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. So folks, what we're going to do, Rupali, this was great. So folks, what we're going to do is that we're going to do a lightning round of questions. So go ahead and put an exclamation mark for your questions. And then we'll take all the questions first, list all the questions, and we're going to give lightning answers to all the questions. So I have just a couple of comments, and then Rob has a comment. So Rupali, I think your presentations are adding a lot of value to to this entire discussion. Just like Louis Sullivan goes to the trees and nature to get inspiration of how human beings should be, another way of getting the inspiration is to look at children, because they are not encumbered with all the wrong forms. They are starting out. So you can see the seed. And Maria Montessori has put a lot of thought in how to cultivate that seed and to see the parallels between that and what Louis Sullivan is doing. I think it's actually illustrating Louis Sullivan's point really well. So thank you very much. This is fantastic. Now, folks, so go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have questions, and we're going to take all questions all together, and we're going to do a lightning round. Rob has something to say about Chicago.
Okay, so since it was brought up, and Sherri and I used to live in Chicago, that's where we met Shrikant, actually. I met Shrikant online, but it's where we met him first in person. I did want to mention Sherri, and this reason I wanted to talk about, I was going to brag about what Sherri does. Sherri gave, when we lived there, gave an architectural walking tour of Chicago that I still have very fond memories of. I think Shrikant's been on this one.
Yes, I have been to it.
And the great thing about Chicago architecturally is, first of all, you can do a walking tour and cover, basically the entire sort of main downtown area, the Loop, as they call it. You can cover that in a walking tour. It's not like New York, which is like 5 times larger. And the other thing is that Chicago was always a very innovative city architecturally, always very open to new ideas. And so when you go through Chicago, you're just walking down this route that we devised. You're just walking down this route, and every style and every era of architecture has some really interesting representative there. So you get to sort of see the whole development of architecture over a period of 150 years, just walking down on this relatively simple route through the city, with outstanding examples of all different types. So that's what I really liked about Chicago as a city for looking at architecture. And maybe after this is all over, we'll go back and visit and invite anybody who wants to join us to do that.
Wonderful. I would love to talk more about Chicago in the next week, because I think it's a very large point of Chicago versus New York at that time. So, and I know Sherri has a lot to say. So, but we're going to take the lightning round of questions. So folks, if you have questions, just go ahead, just questions. Okay. So, and we'll take all the questions together, and then everybody gets to answer them in a lightning round fashion. So first question, Tom, what's your question? Oh, just a second. Wait a minute. I need to change the settings. Yes, Tom, go ahead.
Okay, particularly to Sherri, but others might want to answer it. So Sullivan is constantly criticizing the academics teaching architecture. And I remember you talking about your own experiences, and it struck me that things didn't really get better for 100 years. Is it what is the progress of great teaching of architecture in the world? Wonderful.
Next question is from Joe.
So it has to do a little bit with what you're talking about with the idea of speed and evolution of man. And is the speed and evolution, when compared to, say, nature or anything else, killing the individual spirit in the process?
Okay. Very good. Does anybody have any questions? This is the time to ask questions, and then we'll go to all the answers. Maritza and Ash.
Wait, can Joe re-ask that question?
We'll repeat all the questions.
Okay.
Maritza.
Shrikant, you wrote down the power to do in our chat here. How, or would you separate that with the power to will? Would you make it a similarity or a difference?
Okay, excellent. Power to do and power to will. Okay, anybody else? Questions, last chance, gone. All right. So first question is, what's the state of teaching of architecture for Sherri? Folks, answers have to be very quick, because we've got, folks, I have to tell you, I've got an incredible meetup at 5 o'clock. It's going to be on development, advent of consciousness children.
So what's
just a second, wait. Laura, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm
Go ahead,
typing it.
ask the question.
Okay, I want to know how they feel this might change with the advent of handheld technology because of the way language has changed, writing has changed, music has changed. I mean, all of the arts have changed. So that's my question.
What's the question? I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
I mean, how, looking at what you've all spoken about,
Mhm.
how may this have changed with the advent of
Got it.
handheld technology?
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay. All right. Where was I? Okay. So we're going to. I was telling you about the meetup coming up. It's going to be about advent of consciousness in children. How does consciousness develop from infant onwards? How do you get the concept of, that you have a consciousness? When do children realize it, and what are the steps involved in doing that? This guy has done tremendous amount of research on it. It's a detailed presentation of 30 slides, which is incredible. So that starts at 5 o'clock. So we will have to wrap this up at about 4:50 or so. All right. So answers, very quick answers. Sherri, what's the state of architecture in 3 lines?
In 3 lines, I think it's a lot like what Sullivan talks about. There are the unique individuals who are doing firsthand work. They're always out there. They always have been. They're not the majority. I'm not sure they ever will be the majority, but they exist even in architecture schools today. And by the grace of one or more such people, I actually got out of architecture school with a degree. So they exist.
Wonderful. I also want to point out that Rupali learned lots of her architecture from somebody who was outside.
I was just going to say that.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Rupali.
I was just going to say, across, I mean, I can talk about India. I don't know about the status of architecture studies here, but I can say in India, there's this hit and miss way of doing it. There's whatever's popular gets put in the curriculum, but no one is really looking at it holistically like Louis Sullivan is. And I just don't understand why this book is not made mandatory for all educators, not just architecture educators, but all educators.
Wonderful. Excellent. So the next question is from Joe. Does the speed at which things, I will not use the term evolution, I will use like cultural development, because it's all kind of consciously, it's human beings making products which are accelerating it. So does that kill individuality? Is that the question? Is that correct, Joe? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Anybody answers?
Repeat the question again.
The question is that human beings are on this complete tear of cultural evolution, cultural development, where we are making products and everything keeps changing all the time. Is that a factor that impairs the individuality or creation of individual? Go ahead.
I'd say the opposite, because the big thing I noticed is that the fact that we're here, right? So the fact that this small group of people from across the country and across the world can get together and have an interesting discussion, which would not really have been possible. There's a greater uniformity, I think, in the past, when you had to have a certain amount of resources and a certain amount of technological ability to get people together. You had to have larger institutions there to get people together to do anything. Whereas now there's just a tremendous variety. I mean, Sherri was mentioning earlier, I've been busy in the last week because I've been starting a new project. I started a new publication. Well, the biggest problem I'm having is not that how difficult it is to start a new publication, is that it's so easy that about a half dozen other people I know have done the same thing. And trying to organize, like, well, how am I different from them, and what are they overlapping with? And there's a lot of competition. I think that there's a tremendous variety and individuality of things out there right now because of the rapidity of the technological change. So I think it helps towards individuality. And it even means that, you know, when something does catch on, it can scale up very quickly to a larger audience. But it just means that a huge diversity of things can be done.
Anybody else wants to answer in brief?
If I could
Maritza,
just
go
jump
ahead.
in, I'm of a mind that it's a yes and no answer, because while I don't disagree with what Rob just said, I can also see the flip side happening. There's just so much noise that a more timid voice of individuality will just drown.
Wonderful. Anybody else? Okay, I mean, I certainly think that it is the responsibility of directing your consciousness becomes more and more important. And if you don't take that, and if you start to be passive, you're going to just get drowned by, you know, social media, everything that is coming at you. But if you take the responsibility of saying, okay, I'm going to direct my consciousness, the opportunities are many, many orders of magnitude, hundreds of times more. It also, let's take connection with that Laura's question. How does, you know, given the new technology, handheld technology, all kinds of technological change, how does all these ideas were done 100, 150 years ago. How do these ideas apply today in the realm of all the high tech we have? Anybody?
Well, I would say that, you know, again, going back to the point, if you use it correctly, then you can spread these ideas. You can, you know, give a voice to these ideas. But then if they're not used correctly, you know, it can be a deterrent. Now, one of the things that Maria Montessori talks about, the advent of language, right? That's such a powerful invention of humans. And by having the ability to communicate in a written form, you can reach so many more people. Similarly, with the digital form, you can reach so many more people across the world in such a short amount of time. Again, I think it's how we choose to use and consume that technology.
Wonderful. Anybody else?
Yeah, I like to look at this in the historical perspective. When we first got the printing press, it was like putting jet fuel to communication. People's ideas could get moved farther, faster, with greater potential impact. But at the same time, there was a lot more stuff being published. The same thing happened again in once we all got computers with desktop computers, and everybody had Microsoft Publisher and used 15 different fonts and made their own little newsletter. You know, again, everybody, and then blogs came along and everybody was out there doing a blog. It is an increase in quantity, yes, but it also has the greater potential of connecting the individuals that are trying to connect. And we are an example right here of that power happening. So it's like Shrikant said, it's up to us to make the right choices, to spend the quality time doing the things that make a difference in our lives, rather than just wasting the time because there's another wave of text coming your way.
Next up is going to be Tom.
I just want to throw in something real quick.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm generally leery of anything that says we're doing things radically differently because of technology. Generally, we do the same thing in a slightly different way. And I just want to throw in a recommendation for something called Pessimist's Archive. It's a Twitter feed, and I think it's also a podcast, where they go back and they find these examples of from 80, 100, 120 years ago of people freaking out over the deleterious effect of some new technology that's like bicycles or paperback books, all that sort of thing. And you realize that none of any of the technological pessimism that people have, none of that's new. It's all been done before with the technology we now take for granted.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Tom.
Yes, so I think I read Sullivan as extremely relevant today to the problems I encounter in high tech, a lot of software and stuff like that. The need for idealists rather than money grubbing people, the need for good, solid, basic education. okay? The need for the serving of humanity rather than one's self or one's ego, okay? Those are problems today, and Sullivan is spot on. That's why I enjoy being here. That's it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. We have one more question, and then Dave. Dave, you have, can you put your question on the table? Go ahead.
No, just a comment.
Go ahead.
That a building is permanent. It's a statement in time.
Mhm.
And so we're talking about all these changes in technology. I have a software change, my computer updates and this, that, and the other. But that's an interesting way to determine what's a great building, a building that lives. We have a Catholic cathedral in town. They're talking about tearing down because it's too expensive to maintain. But when I have international students visit with me, I show them the Space Needle that looks like it's brand new. And I think it's 50 years old now. It's timeless. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment about that.
Okay, thank you. The question was on the power of technology. Anybody has anything to say more about how technology is changing everything? And I really like Rob's comment, is that technology just enables you to do that, to do different things. It just makes things faster. It makes kind of much larger space, larger time. So it just kind of extends something. The functions remain the same. So if you want to be a tribe, it'll allow you to be a tribe. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, in that regard, I'm not me, am I? Okay. In that regard, I once challenged people to ask, because we talk about new technology is putting people out of work and it's getting rid of jobs. I challenge people to say, well, name a job that has actually been removed by technology. And so people would say, well, what about sawyers? And I said, well, I just talked to a sawyer,
Yeah.
2 weeks before. And he, a sawyer today is not
He's
a
a
guy with a
freelancer.
handsaw. He's a guy who owns a portable sawmill and who'll come out and cut down, and I found him on the internet, right?
Yeah.
So there are very few jobs that have actually disappeared because of technology. What generally happens is you do the job differently. But, how you do the job has changed, but the job itself has not disappeared.
Yeah, we've all done that in the last year,
Yeah,
haven't we?
exactly.
Okay, last question is from Maritza. She's asking, what's the relationship between power to do and power of choice?
I have a short answer to that.
Go ahead.
So my short answer is wait and see the autobiography of an idea, because I would describe that even that book is the story of the development from the power to do to the power to will. And also just keep your eyes out for the rest of this book. In my mind, the whole concept of I will is so important, and we're going to see how it blossoms literally as we continue through this book. So hopefully we all continue to track that. And thanks to Maritza for pointing it out.
So I want to add something here. In this chapter, Another City, Louis Sullivan says, there's leaven here, I will. I mean, there's potential there that something is going to transform, something better is going to happen. And so I think with the I will, there is potential, and I do, there's creation.
Wonderful. Anybody else? Robin, Sherri? Okay. See, what he has is that he has a hierarchy of different things. So do is simply action. So that's like even at a single cell level life, there is action. And then there are all these hierarchies of different abilities, human abilities that sit on the top of that. And I will is a directing ability. It's ability to direct. It's like it is a point of maximum leverage where you can direct all your other faculties, including your power to do. So it is something that is directing your mind. It is directing, what you're creating. So it's like, for me, it's like the smallest of the rudders. The I don't know what it is called. The little rudder, which changes the other rudder and the other rudder, and the doer is the outside, the most outside of the ones. All right, folks. So this is fantastic. The presentations. Yes. So Rupali, I'm going to call on you in just a second. So folks, thank you very much. Okay. So first, Sherri has something, and then Rupali has something. Sherri.
Well, I'm just reading in the chat here that Rohit has a question about learning architecture in the apprentice model. in the US, and I haven't checked recently, but when I was in architecture school, which was a long time ago, you could not, you couldn't do it. You had to go through an accredited school and an accredited program. And so it was limited. The only school that had a similar sort of thing was Frank Lloyd Wright's school, Taliesin, but they didn't, and I actually considered going there, but they weren't accredited. So you could go all the way through architecture school, but you couldn't work as an architect because they weren't accredited. So there's overlay of governmental processes there that are keeping they're tamping things down because of that. Yeah.
Rupali, go ahead.
So I just want to end this with this passage from Another City. And it talks about a visionary, a leader. What are qualities of a leader? Louis Sullivan says, so if there are to be dreams, there must be dreamers to dream them. And there can be no greatness unless dreamers dream of it. Still, it may be a foolish dream, a dream born of the incomparable lake and the strong, silent, lovely prairies. Who knows? One must indeed be incurably optimistic, even momentarily, to dream such a dream.
Wonderful. So folks, next time we are going to do from elements of architecture up to what is an architect. So it's going to be about 20 pages. Okay, so page 120 to page 142. All right, so fantastic. Thank you very much. If you want to stay for Advent of Consciousness in Children, you're welcome to stay. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.